In this HY302 topic, we continue our discussion of the theme of resistance, focusing on the period from 1900 to 1945, where there were transformations and transitions within Fijian society. Many of our readings and discussions are based on the work of historian Dr. Robert Nicole, whose book, Disturbing History, is freely accessible online through the USP Library database, and who explores the different ways in which all members of Fijian society, both indigenous Fijians as well as migrants, resisted against British colonial rule. In this video, we will be considering three key questions. The first was, how did Indo-Fijians engage in everyday resistance on the plantations? The second was, how successful were organised protests and strikes from 1900 to 1945? And third, what people and events contributed to the end of indenture and the emerging political consciousness of Indo-Fijians? Before we begin our slides, I'd like to draw your attention to the change in name that we are now using. For the Gomitias, who first came as indentured labourers to Fiji, they were termed Indians by the British colonial government. But during the period 1900 to 1945, we see a gradual shift in terminology, as there are descendants of these Gomitias being born and raised in Fiji. In some documents, they were referred to as Indo-Fijians or as Fiji Indians. In scholarship, historians like Bridge v. Lal have tended to refer to them as Indo-Fijians as a group, even though the official terminology in today's society is Fijians of Indian descent. Nonetheless, we will continue to use this term Indo-Fijians to refer to those descendants of the Gomitias who were living in Fiji at this time period. The readings this week will focus on the emerging Indo-Fijian community that developed a stronger political consciousness after the end of indenture in 1920. If you look at the readings for this week, I'd like to draw your attention to some of the key points that Robert Nicole highlighted in his book, Disturbing History. Robert Nicole argued that the British viewed violence as criminal and irrational, and there are many documents in the National Archives of Fiji, including court reports, police reports, and correspondence between colonial officials, that describe violence on plantations between Indo-Fijian labourers. In many cases, these crimes were reported as being completely irrational and often motivated by jealousy. A common complaint was that there were so few women on the plantations that men were motivated to fight each other because of this sexual jealousy. Nicole turns this thesis on its head and argues that this view was completely wrong. In actual fact, using archival evidence, he shows that violence was often retributive. That is, quote, violent acts of retaliation were often driven by an outraged sense of injustice, and attacks on overseers and sardars were often committed in public view with full knowledge of the likely consequences, end quote. Just to refresh from our previous discussions, overseers were often European-appointed supervisors who would run the plantations, but they would rely on middlemen or sardars, often Indo-Fijians who were appointed to supervise the rest of the labourers. And we see tensions between these supervisors, whether they were the European overseer or the Indo-Fijian sardar. Robert Nicole notes over time that violence would depend on particular plantations and overseers. In some cases, there were overseers who treated their labourers according to regulations and actually were quite understanding of the situations at the time. However, there were also particular plantations or overseers who were extremely brutal and harsh, and we see cases of their plantations appearing more frequently in the record. One example that Robert Nicole gives is that violence was increasing in Lambasa from 1895, and this may correlate with the establishment of a new sugar estate and mill, and also the remoteness of Lambasa from the colonial centre in Suva. This made it more difficult for colonial supervisors, police officers, and court officials to maintain law and order in these distant plantations. So there are a number of factors at play here. Robert also notes that violence not only occurred against supervisors, but it could also occur against other labourers, and also violence against oneself. And I think that's an important one to note. Scholars like Bridge-Lal have written a lot about the prevalence of suicide in plantations in Fiji, and how this may reflect the social harms caused by this indenture system. So there are a number of different factors explaining violence on plantations, and we can't necessarily buy in to the dominant view put forward by British colonial officials that all violence on the plantations was criminal, irrational, and often motivated by jealousy. So now let's consider some different ways in which ordinary labourers on the plantation would engage in resistance every day. Robert Nicole, in his reading, outlines a number of different ways in which Indian indentured labourers would protest by avoiding work. This included instances of absenteeism, where labourers would not show up to work, desertion, where labourers would actually run away from their plantations and desert completely, or even sabotage. Sabotage refers to instances where labourers would damage equipment, meaning that they couldn't complete their task because their equipment was damaged, or even damaging the crops themselves. In some cases, we also have reports of drugs, including marijuana, Indian hemp, and alcohol, as well as instances of gambling. And these are all forms of activities which may be considered resistance on the plantation. There are some very rare cases of formal written petitions that were taken to the courts in Fiji. But can you think of why this might be a rare or unpopular option for Indian indentured labourers? Pause the video now and see if you can think of a reason that might explain why very few Indian indentured labourers submitted petitions. Okay, perhaps you've unpaused the video. Why might that be the case? Well, Robert Nicole notes that at the time, the indentured system was geared in favour of British colonial overseers. This meant that not only did the overseer occupy a position of power over Indians, but also Europeans generally in the colony occupied a position of privilege and power over other races. This meant that in the courts, which were governed by European appointed judges and magistrates, and which were held in English, many Indians who were often illiterate or unfamiliar with English laws found it very difficult to use this system to their advantage. And when they did submit petitions, these petitions were often ignored or dismissed based on testimonies by overseers and other colonial officials that attacked these claims of mistreatment. So the court system really was unfair, and Indians recognised this. So this might explain why very few formal petitions or cases were lodged to the courts against overseers. Apart from these forms of resistance, we might think more broadly about other ways in which Indian communities formed bonds together and engaged in other activities which we might consider forms of resistance. Resistance in the sense that they resisted against colonial attempts to divide and rule Indian communities and actually forge new connections between disparate groups. Religion was an important source of spiritual strength on the plantation, and also an excellent way of bringing people together. Indian indentured labourers, who were often split up into different plantations on purpose when they arrived in Fiji, had to forge new connections, and they did this through celebrating religious festivals and also bringing over priests or pundits to inform their religious ceremonies and provide instruction. Remember, during the Indian indentured labour system, there were no schools available for that community. And so some of the earliest examples of community organisations were those formed to establish schools for Indo-Fijians. We see experiments by the Maris brothers to open schools in Turak. One of the earliest ones was opened by Hannah Dudley in 1894. But we also see Indian communities like the Arya Samaj religious organisation organising themselves in 1902 to create a school for its members at Samambula in Suva. We fast forward to today and we see a number of these organisations have been prominent in education in Fiji, and their schools have flourished over time and become some of the leading schools in Fiji. This is in spite of the fact that the colonial government did not provide any support for Indian education at that time. And there's a great new field of studies for prospective masters and PhD students, looking at the histories of some of these religious groups and the schools that they founded. I'd really like to encourage maybe some of our budding historians in our class to think about these potential topics in the future. We've mentioned briefly about religion, and I may digress here just to make one other mention about the Methodist Church, which at the time was the dominant denomination within Fiji, and one that had members in both the European and the indigenous Fijian communities. Kirsty Close-Barry is a historian who's published a book looking at the divisions within the Methodist Church in Fiji and the establishment of an Indian division to cater for increasing numbers of Christian Indians which would emerge in Fiji in the early 1900s. In some of these cases, Indian indentured labourers that came from India were already Christian, and in other cases there were instances of conversion within Fiji by missionaries. And we see very slowly the gradual recognition of Indian congregations within Methodist churches, and also the need to provide support to Indian communities. And that support was largely provided by missionaries, European missionaries who identified a gap or an absence of support from the colonial government. So if you'd like to read more about that distinction, I strongly suggest Kirsty Close-Barry's online book titled A Mission Divided, and I'll put a link to that in the bibliography. In our next video, we'll think a little bit more about some examples of organised strikes and protests and how successful these were in the period of 1900 to 1940.